first thing I probably wanted to ask you was whereabouts were you living when war broke out, Mr. Leadbeater?
When war broke out, I was living in Stanley Road, number 14, and I would be 3 years old when war broke out in 1939. Right.
Who was at home with you during that time?
I'd got an older brother, Geoffrey, who was born in 1932, and my mother. There were the four of us living at home. My father was working at the time for a firm called Brown's in Wimslow, but he couldn't be called up because he had a deformity in his back. He would be 39 when war broke out. So he then was allocated to the Ministry of Works, and he spent the war repairing airfields which had been bombed, because his profession was an architect. So that's where he spent the war. But from time to time he did come home, but he wasn't home very much at all during the war. Yeah.
Did you go to school during the war?
Yes. Started school in the infant school, which in those days was in Silkmill Street, opposite what is now Knutsford Market. And I can remember quite clearly starting when I was 5 years old in 1941 at the infant school, and we sat at the desk where two of you sat at them, and the inkwells were there, and I can't quite remember, but I have a feeling that we didn't have any books. We did everything on slate with chalk, but I think later on we got round to having books that we could write in. But we were only there for 2 years, and then we went up to the Edgerton School, which is of course opposite the church, right? And I was at Edgerton School until I was 11 years old. But of course that would be, let's work it out, it would be after the war had finished. Yeah.
Do you remember any evacuees coming to school?
Yes, definitely.
Knutsford?
The thing about the evacuees was we were very excited because the train that came in with the evacuees was twice as long as any train which had come into Knutsford during the war. And it was so long that they had to let the first few carriages, people out, and then the train had to move up for the last bit of the train. And the evacuees came and they all went to the town hall, and then the families in Knutsford went and they were allocated evacuees. We actually had a little girl, because I think most of the evacuees came from the Stretford area. And she came and stayed with us, but only stayed with us for about 4 or 5 months, and then she went back home to Stretford. She was allowed to go back home to Stretford.
Did most of them go back home, or did most?
No, because I remember the evacuees coming to school when we were there, and some of them were in homes. There was a home in Knutsford called Winstanley, and there was a home in Knutsford called Kilree. And they came to school during the war together with any of the evacuees.
Did the children from Knutsford and the evacuees get on, or were they quite different type of children? Was there a bit of...
Not really, no. We used to play, do all kinds of things with the evacuees on the heath. Yeah. And one of the things we used to do, we used to sit on, there were some seats on the heath then, we used to sit on the seats and watch the planes take off from what was called Ringway then, in other words, Manchester Airport, and then they would drop the parachutes over Tatton Park, and all the parachutes would land in Tatton Park, because that was where they started the parachute regiment at Ringway, and as most people know, there's a memorial to it in Tatton Park. And we used to sit on the seats with the evacuees, watching the planes take off and drop the parachutes. Yeah.
Did the evacuees seem homesick? Was it different from them living in what must have been quite a rural place to a very big urban area?
I think they did find it different, but they seemed to integrate very, very easily, especially at school. I remember them quite distinctly at school. And some of them made very, very good friends in Knutsford, and some of them came back and lived in Knutsford after the war because they'd been evacuated here. Yeah.
Do you remember the air raid shelters or air raid practices?
Yes. We were all issued with gas masks in cases, which we took with us every day to school. And then at Edgerton School, the area where we've now got Booth's Supermarket was what we call the prison site, because that used to be the Knutsford prison. And during the war, they built shelters on there, but these were big shelters where they could accommodate 40 or 50 people. And part of the shelters was above ground with a mound over the top, which was grass, and the rest of the shelters were underneath the ground. And we used to have practices whereby the air raid warning siren would go, and we'd all leave the school opposite the church, across the road and onto the site and into the air raid shelters, and we'd sit in the air raid shelters for a certain length of time, and then we'd go back to the school. And that was the practice. We never actually, during the Second World War, were ever evacuated because there was an actual air raid. All the air raids that we had sirens sounded for in Knutsford were all at night. We never had to go from school into the air raid shelters, but we had practices, of course, of doing it. Yeah.
So do you remember going to an air raid shelter at night with your parents?
No. What happened when the air raid sirens went, my mother used to get well, there was 3 of us then because my sister was born in 1941, used to get us all up, and we used to all squeeze into a cupboard underneath the staircase, because if anything happened and there was a bomb drop, the staircase was under the staircase was the safest place to be. So there used to be 4 of us underneath the staircase. It was a bit of a squash, and we waited there until the all clear came, and then we could get out. Yeah.
Do you remember how you felt when it went? Were you excited? Were you frightened?
It was a funny situation, really, because being so young, we were excited as well as frightened. We were obviously frightened, but we were also a little bit excited because we didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what was going to happen. So it was a mixture, really, I would say. Yeah.
Do you remember a bomb actually landing in Knutsford at all?
Yes, we heard about the bomb landing in Knutsford, and I think it's fairly true that the bomb did land at one of the large houses on Toff Road, and a lady was killed. Apparently she was in the rear of the house when it happened. And from what we can gather, it was a stray bomb from when the air raids were carried out on Manchester and then on Liverpool, of course. To get to Liverpool, some of the planes came over Knutsford. We could hear them. We could hear them. And we could hear the planes when they were coming in to bomb Manchester. And we could see the glow. We could see the glow of when they bombed Manchester, you know, from here. We're 15 miles away, but we could still see the glow. Yeah.
Do you remember the town being different, you know, blackouts and not being lights and things like that? If you walked around Knutsford, can you describe what it was like?
It was very dark. We had at about 4 o'clock at night, we had to put shutters up on all our windows on the ground floor, because that was where we could have the lights on. So we had to make sure there was no light coming out of them. And the same thing applied in Knutsford, in the towns. They all had shutters that they put up. The other thing, of course, which we had in Knutsford was big signs putting EWS, emergency water supply, and all those kind of things, so that people knew where they could get water in the case of an air raid and fires and everything else. And there were lots of those. And in fact, they renewed those when they filmed the film called Patton, which they filmed in Knutsford. Yeah.
Can you remember what rationing was like?
Oh, yes.
You must have had a ration book.
We had a ration book, green ration book, and I always remember the back of it. That was for oranges. Because after this came after the war, oranges came, and we had to mark off at the back of the book how many oranges we'd had. But as far as ration books were concerned, there was a grocer in Canute Square called Mr. Royal, and my mother used to go down there and give him an order. They didn't have butter wrapped up. They just sliced butter off a big slab and wrapped it up there. And then I used to go with a wheelbarrow, right, from where I lived in Stanley Road, down Gaskell Avenue to Mr. Royal's, and he used to put all this provisions that my mother had ordered with the ration book, right, and then I used to bring them home to Stanley Road in the wheelbarrow, because they didn't deliver then.
Do you remember missing sweets? Was that something that you can remember as a kid?
Yeah, there was Mrs. Woodcock had a sweet shop on King Street at the bottom of what I call Church Hill, next door to the restaurant. It's now a hairdresser's. And my mother used to go with this ration book and buy the sweets on a Friday, and then we used to come home and we put them all on the table and divide them into 4 lots. 1 for my mother and 3 for us. So that's what happened with sweets, depending on what we could get on the ration book.
Do you remember digging up the garden or growing your own vegetables at home? Or there was a dig for victory, wasn't there? People had to turn gardens, allotments and things into growing food. Do you remember anything about that? Yes, what happened was Edgerton School had an allotment on what was then a field, which is where the high school is now. They had an allotment, and for 2 or 3 sessions during the week, we all used to go to work on the allotments where they used to grow turnips and swedes and things like that. So, and then we used to bring them back to the school, and they used to sell them to the residents of the town. So that's what they had. The school had allotments. Did you have land girls in Knutsford? Do you remember seeing anybody helping? Because it's quite rural. Anybody helping with the harvest? I can't recall seeing land girls, but I know that there were land girls in the area. Yeah, definitely. Did you see any military personnel in Knutsford during the war? Well, of course. Opposite where I lived in Stanley Road was a hospital for prisoners of war, etc.
And so therefore we did see a lot of soldiers who were looking after the prisoners of war. Right, so we did see soldiers in Knutsford quite a lot. Then, of course, the thing that we all remember is the American army coming onto the heath. And as you know, the Knutsford people are very proud of the heath. And all of a sudden, these Americans came and they started laying proper roads across the heath and putting permanent buildings up. So we wondered what was going on. And then, of course, the whole army, General Patton's army, came and they stayed in tents. And the buildings they put up were for canteens and places like that. So we saw a lot of the American soldiers. Now, what is now lost and found was used as the Americans', what shall I say, canteen for out of office hours. In other words, when they weren't in training, they used to use it as the equivalent to the British Army's NAFI. When we came out of school, there was a lady at the side of the building, lost and found. She was making donuts, and we all used to have donuts as we came out of school, and they were being made for the Americans. And then, of course, we used to take jam jars or anything we could find down to the entrance to the heath, and they used to fill them with hot chocolate. And if the ladies were lucky, they would get a pair of nylons and things like that. And the Americans used to give us, and of course the favourite phrase was, "Have you any gum, chum?" And they used to give us chewing gum, all those kind of things. But they were smashing having the Americans here, and they were all over the town, all over the town.
Did your parents like having the Americans? I can understand the children liking having the Americans here. Was everybody in Knutsford, do you think, pleased to have them here?
I think they were. Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Do you remember seeing General Patton in the war in Knutsford?
Yes, I remember seeing General Patton because he was making his speech in front of the town hall, and we were coming out of school from the building behind the town hall. So we saw all these soldiers all listening to General Patton as we were coming out of school.
How did you get your news during the war? Can you remember?
We had a radio during the war on which we could listen to the news. And I can always remember because it had a battery in it which had to be charged. And I used to take the battery down to a garage near the Conservative Club in Knutsford. There was a garage on the opposite side of the road. He used to charge the battery up. And then it was a liquid battery, quite a big one. And that's where we got all the news about the war, on the radio. No television, of course.
Was it a big event that everybody in the family would listen to the news at a certain time? Would everybody, all right, it's the news time?
Yeah, it was always 6 o'clock. It was always 6 o'clock for the news. And of course, my mother used to listen to it. I don't think, not being that old, we took, I can't say we really sat and listened to it, but that's how we got the news about the war.
Do you remember much about VE Day in Knutsford?
Yes. Now, as far as Knutsford was concerned, as you know, they have a May Day festival, and during the May Day festival, a big fairground comes. Now, the government allowed fairgrounds to carry on during the war. And the fairground happened to be here on the small heath on VE Day, and it stayed an extra 3 or 4 days to celebrate VE Day, because as you know, VE Day was in May, right? And that's how we know that the fairground was here at that particular time. And in those days, it was a much smaller fairground, but it was all pulled by big traction engines. One was called Victory and the other one was called Clara. And they used to bring a few roundabouts, not a lot, a few roundabouts, and all the wagons had solid tyres. They didn't have blow-up tyres, they all had solid tyres. And they had a caterpillar ride where a hood was supposed to come over as the ride was going round. Well, of course, the hood had got destroyed, and so you just sat on this thing and went round and round. There was no hood came over, but that was because of the war. But the fairground came, the Dodgems came, the Walser came, and all the other roundabouts came, but in a much smaller size because it was all on the small heath. Because, of course, General Patton with his army, the American general, was on the large heath, so we couldn't use the large heath.
Did you have a holiday from school for VE Day?
I can't be sure. I have a feeling we did, but I can't be absolutely sure I remember having a holiday. No.
So was all the celebrations around the fair, or was the bigger celebrations in the town with the sort of street parties?
I think that in the VE Day time, we actually each more or less area of the town, you'd got the houses in Warren Avenue, you got the houses in St John's Avenue, St John's Road and Stanley Road, and then you'd got houses in Crossdown and all other kinds of places. The people who lived in Stanley Road and St John's Road and all got together and more or less had a picnic on the prison site where all the shelters were. That's where we had it, because I always remember they made attempts to celebrate November the 5th by having a bonfire on the prison site. And that was when all the neighbours got together and made parking and treacle toffee and things like that. Yeah. So we did try and celebrate November the 5th, even during the war. But of course they didn't like us lighting fires in those days, no.
Do you remember soldiers coming home from the war? Do you remember families around you that were affected? Because obviously some families must have had sad wars and other people obviously...
No, I can't recall too many. I had two uncles in the war. One of them was in the RAF and the other one was in the army. But Uncle Morris spent the whole of the war in Anglesey because he was in the transport department, and he was there to organise the troops sailing out of Holyhead. And he spent the whole of the war in Anglesey. My other uncle, Uncle Cyril, was in the RAF, and he was all over Europe during the war because after the war he went back to Rhodesia because he was stationed there during the war, and he went back there for a short while after the war.
Do you remember the American soldiers going home?
Well, yes, we do, because what happened was we got all these soldiers all on the heath living in tents and that, and they weren't there a long time. Then all of a sudden there was none. They weren't there. They'd all gone, more or less overnight. So I do remember the place being empty when they'd all gone. And of course they didn't come back.
What about prisoners of war? Were they part of the town? I know you said there was a hospital, but were prisoners of war involved in Knutsford during the war?
Yes, lots of prisoners of war. They were all housed in tents, etc., at Toft Hall. Toft Hall, which is opposite Toft Church. The whole of the area from the main road up to the actual Toft Hall was covered with tents. It's all a wooded area now, but that was covered in tents. And what is called Knutsford Community Hospital now was the hospital for injured prisoners of war, both German and Italian, right? And they used to wander around the town with nobody with them, the prisoners of war. But they were treated at the hospital, which is now Knutsford Community Hospital.
How did people in the town treat the prisoners of war?
They treated them very well. They treated them very well. One or two of the ladies finished up after the war marrying Germans that had been prisoners of war in Knutsford. They probably met them while they were in Knutsford, but I know for a fact they married them. And that was because the town accepted them, you know. The town accepted them as prisoners of war, yeah. They weren't marched round or anything like that.
Would you say that as a child in Knutsford in the Second World War, it was quite an exciting thing to have gone through?
It was. It was a very exciting time because we didn't know what was going to happen the day after. You know, all kinds of things happened as people realise in the war, but we didn't know. We didn't know. There was always something going on somewhere. If it was a case of during the day when we weren't at school, we used to go down to what is now called Stanley Park, and we used to watch all the trains going through Knutsford with tanks on them and army vehicles and all kinds of things. And we'd never seen trains which were so long. They were massive long trains because Knutsford had just ordinary trains delivering coal and stuff like that. But in the war there were great long trains, and because the railway line goes uphill from Knutsford station to what we call Bexton Bridge, right? And it's quite a steep incline, and some of these trains couldn't get up. It was too steep for them to get up. So there used to be an engine that they used to keep in Knutsford station, and that engine used to get onto the back of the trains as they came through Knutsford and push from the back, and they were called banking engines, and that's what we used to watch. So it was different. It was exciting all the time. It was exciting, and then of course we had the American Army and all kinds of things. So as far as you know, children were concerned, especially children of my age in the teens, it was an exciting time, no doubt about it. I mean, I used to go and get coke from the gasworks, because in those days there was a gasworks in Knutsford at the end of I think it's called Windsor Way now. There used to be a gasworks, and there used to be coke, which was a byproduct of making gas. And we used to go on a Saturday morning with our barrows and see Mr. Briggs, who was the manager, and pay him what is the equivalent of 12p for a barrow load of coke, because in the days of the war we were only allowed one bag of coal per week. And our coal man was a Mr. Gillett, who used to come every day. And I was frightened to death of him because he always had a black face from the coal and that. And he used to scare me to death because he was a big man, and he used to carry these bags of coal on his back, you know, and come down the passage and dump them in the coal house. I was frightened to death of him. I think that the thing I'd like to say is that there were various characters in Knutsford during the war who stood out to me when I was a boy because you saw them all week. Now, one of them was Mr. Gillett, who brought the coal every week. The other one was Mr. Gregory, who was the chimney sweep. Because in those days, you see, everybody burnt coal, and so they had to have the chimneys swept, else they'd catch fire. And he was a man who my mother used to say the night before, right, now you don't get up tomorrow morning, you stay in bed. Mr. Gregory's coming to clean the chimney. And the reason for that was that there was so much soot came down that my mother had to clean the rooms before we got up because they made so much mess. But I remember him, and he was one of the characters. And then there was a Mr. Blythe. Mr. Blythe was the milkman. We didn't have bottles of milk in those days. What happened was he had a converted Morris car, and on the back there was a great big copper, what would you call it, churn. Let's put it like that, because you had milk churns. But this was massive. And we used to take a jug out, and Mr. Blythe used to open up this churn and fill the mug with milk. And you always remember people like this because they were there every week, bringing the milk, bringing the coal, coming to clean. The other one was a Mr. Ormes. Now, Mr. Ormes had a vegetable shop in King Street, and he used to deliver the vegetables, etc., on a bike with a carrier at the front, and you could often see him riding round the town with 6 or 7 boxes piled up. He couldn't see where he was going, but he used to come round the town with all the vegetables. And these are the kind of characters which you remember from the war because they were so involved with everybody during the war. And I can remember them. I can remember them coming round with the milk and coming round with the vegetables and everything else. And then like Mr. Royal, who was the man who had the shop in town where you went to get all your provisions, your butter and your sugar and everything else, which was all rationed, of course. Yeah. So those are the kind of things I remember from the war. Apart from everything else that was going on, you remember the characters that there were in the town, along with everything else. I mean, the thing that stands out as far as I'm concerned is seeing the paratroopers, because the paratroopers came, and when they jumped out of the planes, they were all different coloured parachutes. They weren't all white parachutes, right? All different colours and things like that. And then, of course, the trains we used to watch at the station, they stand out because we'd never seen trains that long or that big. So those are the kind of things. And then, of course, we saw the American Army, and we had a fairground every May. Every May, it came the same time as we would have had it for May Day. Yeah.
Do you remember VE Day? VJ Day, sorry.
No, not as much. Not as much VJ Day, because it wasn't celebrated as much, was it really? Because the British Army wasn't really concerned as much in fighting the Japanese as the British were in fighting the Germans. So I can't quite honestly remember much about VJ Day. No. Well, there's now, when you look out there, you can see a glow in the sky, but that's Manchester Airport. Manchester Airport, there's a big, but this was different because this was a real, you could see the glow and you could see stuff going up in the air and all kinds of things, because it was really horrific, that bombing that they had in Manchester and Liverpool. It was, and we could hear the planes coming over. You could hear the drum while we were sat underneath the stairs.
So can you tell me a little bit about seeing that? Where were you? Who were you with? What
We-
was the feelings that you had?
Well, we could only see it by going outside because all the windows on the ground floor had shutters up. You see, everybody had to put shutters up. But that's where we would see it. We would see it at night, of course, obviously because of the glow, but we'd have to go outside to see it from our back garden or from the top of the house I lived in. Fortunately, it was a 3-storey house in Stanley Road. And when you went up to the top floor, there was a window because it was a proper room on the second story. And if you looked from there, you could really see it.
Might I just get you to sit back up in your chair? Sorry, just a second. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me a bit about what you might have heard, or what made you go outside, and what was the emotions?
It was the noise of the planes, and the noise of the explosions. Because obviously we could hear what was going on, you know, from here, because it carries so easily the sound of a bombing raid or something like that. But we definitely could hear it all, yeah.
And how did that make you and your family feel?
I suppose to some extent we were frightened. We were definitely frightened because we could hear the bombers coming over, and we just wondered whether any of them would hit us. But we knew really that what they were after was Manchester, not Knutsford. Yeah. So we were frightened, definitely, yeah. And we were glad to hear the all clear.
Do you think, or did your parents ever talk to you, maybe after the war, about their feelings being different to yours? Obviously, a grown-up's feelings are different from a child's feelings.
I think really, because my father, when he was working for the Ministry of Works, he was down in London during the period at the end of the war when Hitler sent his V1 and V2 rockets over. And it was a frightening time for him, more so than us, because he said they had a certain noise. And he said when you were in London during that period, when you heard that noise, everybody went as quickly as they could for shelter, either down the underground and places like that. And that, he said that was a very frightening time because you couldn't predict where these V2 rockets would go, because they could hear the engine, they could hear the noise, and they knew when that engine cut out, that rocket was going to land somewhere in London. So that was a very frightening time for them. We never had anything like that. But of course, while the planes were flying over, there was always a chance they'd drop some bombs on us. But we were lucky. We were lucky.